Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. A place where history is in the hills, where many have made their home, where seeds of friendship can be sown and new love begins to grow. We welcome back those who've left, who sought fortunes far away, but who have kept Cavan in their soul and will settle in without delay. There's magic in the waterways and the woods where you once stood. The evening lights are always bright and the food is always good. And if you venture to foreign lands, you'll always know you're not alone. Now again, as it was before, you'll be welcomed back to your home. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. Cavan is calling. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. A place where history is in the hills, where many have made their home, where seeds of friendship can be sown and new love begins to grow. We welcome back those who've left, who sought fortunes far away, but who have kept Cavan in their soul and will settle in without delay. There's magic in the waterways and the woods where you once stood. The evening lights are always bright and the food is always good. And if you venture to foreign lands, you'll always know you're not alone. Now again, as it was before, you'll be welcomed back to your home. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. Cavan is calling.
Vital information. The score with Ireland and Canada is 1-1 at the minute. Unfortunately, there was an own goal, but it's 1-1 anyway. I think we take the result. Anyway. Oh yeah. Just apologies for the logistics of the lunch. Some of the food wasn't delivered in time and we weren't sure whether there was more going to come or not, but some did. So I think there might be some available or maybe on the way out. Would that be right? for anyone that suffers greatly in the afternoon. This afternoon's session kicks off now. Mary is going to talk. Her talk's entitled "An Anxious Expectation." The title of the event, Aspects of Emigration from County Cavan. Now, Mary is manager of Cavan Genealogy since 1988, and along with Concepta and Jane has established a genealogical research service where research has been commissioned by thousands of people from Ireland and across the world seeking information on Cavan ancestry. Mary is a member of the board of the Irish Family History Foundation and has lectured widely on genealogical topics and has produced this emigration exhibition which you see around you today. So before you leave, if you haven't had a chance to look at it, take it in, have a look tomorrow. It'll be up for another few days, so it'll be there. So anyway, Mary, An Anxious Expectation.
Thanks, Tom. Okay. Okay, so we're just starting with the letter from 1841. I've used this letter before, so I know well some of you are familiar with it. It's a letter from Belleville in the parish of Kilmore, Ballinyav village, about 6 or 7 miles from here, July 1841. And you can see the bit I've underlined there, in anxious expectation. So I'll just give you the gist of the letter. It's from Patrick Cassidy to his children in America. And the gist of it is that he doesn't want to complain or seem ungrateful, but he wonders why he hasn't heard from them in a long time. They haven't answered his last 2 letters, and he's very uneasy. We've noticed this as a recurring theme in letters, constant apologies. We have a series of letters from the 1920s, 30s and 40s from the same family to and from America. Almost every letter without exception begins with an apology from the people abroad for not writing sooner or whatever. So the impression that I get, or that we get, is that they're under constant pressure to either send money, send tickets, or simply to write and keep in touch. So he talks in the letter about the state of the country. Our gentlemen are all breaking and leaving the country. It's an excellent letter. Okay, it's phonetically spelt, but for 1841, I don't know what age, I forget what age he was. He is in the 1821 census, but it's quite well written. So he talks about the state of the country and how poor things are. He said he bought a fine. He's licking them a bit as well. He bought a fine cow with the last present they sent him, but Providence denied him that comfort as there came a plague on cattle. Now, I did look up cattle plague. I don't know if Brendan or Paddy knows much about cattle plague, or William, or anybody here. The first evidence that I could find was Aidan McCabe, maybe. Was 1865 in the 19th century. I know there was much earlier. But I found nothing about cattle plague in 1841 or that period, so perhaps it was just a localised plague, or maybe he was just exaggerating to get more money. He says he depends on their kindly feeling towards him, which he has always experienced, and then talks about their dear sister Anne, who has waited in anxious expectation of being sent for. In other words, send the money or send the ticket so that we can send her. And she went off and got hired, and she gets bad treatment, and she will pay you back all your trouble when you bring her over. He then refers to their brother John, who is in good health, but also refers to the bad treatment the likes of him may expect to receive in the country. Then an interesting thing in the letter, he talks about the Tory majority in the recent elections, when Robert Peel's Conservatives took control of the House of Commons. And he says, we're now going to lose the little rights that we have. So I presume he's referring to Daniel O'Connell's Repeal Party, which lost 10 seats in that election. So that Daniel O'Connell, Repeal of the Union, his party. So it's interesting that he knows what's going on. So he finishes by earnestly requesting an answer and says he won't write again until he hears from them, and closes, I remain your loving father till death. And then as a postscript he talks about the price of provisions and how trade of all kinds are failed. And another interesting thing, he said, your inquiring friends and neighbours are well. And again, something we've come across in letters, not just the immediate family were reading the letter. It was read by neighbours and other relatives and friends. So I did a lot of research trying to find out what happened to Mary and John. But other than what, and with newspapers abroad and loads of other sources, I simply cannot find anything about them. The only information we have is in the file, the letter that was donated to us quite a long time ago by Michael Cassidy in Maryland, and I thank him for it. And Bernard and Michael were already in New York by 1841, obviously from the letter. Bernard died in New York in 1880. Michael moved to Ohio in 1840s, died there 1862, and John was in New York 1852 and joined Michael and his family in Ohio about 1854, and he was killed during the Civil War, but not in the war, by a falling tree accidentally. So that's the only thing we know about them so far. But I will continue to find out if I can find out anything else about them. So just to what I'm going to talk about today then is just a little bit about the data set that we use for our study on immigration, the findings so far, and just some statistics. And then as Paddy said, the vastness of a study of emigration, and even for County Cavan, it is a massive, massive story. So I'm going to, for me, a lot of the information is about every single immigrant has a personal story. So I'm going to focus on about 7 or 8 stories today. So just to look at the Cavan Diaspora Archive, Paddy referred earlier to local diaspora archives. So the Cavan Diaspora Archive is simply the information that we've got from people since we began in 1988. We began to receive letters, I suppose, almost immediately, 1989, 1990. Letters and inquiries, no email back in them days. Letters and inquiries from people all over the world who were researching their ancestors. Some of the files have a lot of information, some of them are very sketchy, but nonetheless, even if somebody writes an email today and says my grandfather or great-grandfather or whatever arrived in Philadelphia in the late 1870s and his name was this, at least you know that there is a migrant. There is, so you still have information. So as I said, the archive can tell us, not all of them, but a lot of them. Place of origin in the county, religion, age at departure, destinations abroad, marriage patterns abroad, what they did for a living, and mobility of immigrants, which is common to them all, just moved around constantly, and stories of success and tragedy. So it's kind of the tragedy that I'm going to focus on in a lot of the stories today. And as I said, to me, the most important thing is the personal stories illuminate the statistics. Statistics are grand, but can be a bit monotonous too. But as I said, the stories illuminate the statistics. So the ongoing immigration study, Paddy was talking about the 3 S, what was the 3 letters?
SQ3.
Something like that. The D. So our study has focused on details on the immigrants prior to emigration, information following immigration, and well, how they went, we kind of know most of the time anyway. The biggest difference between now and 30 years ago when we started is that we can corroborate the data now, which we couldn't really. We could a certain amount of it with our database, but there's so many more sources becoming available online, so it's easy enough to corroborate, because obviously the nature of the data, people can exaggerate about how their people got on in Australia or America or wherever, but the fact that you can corroborate it is great. So just to look at some of the findings. And the 18th century, I'm not going to on the stories today, it's going to be mostly the post-famine, but the 18th century emigration to America really was from the likes of Coot Hill, North Cavan, the hinterland of the agents where they were set up. So as Paddy said, I went because I could. So they went because the agents were there, giving them telling them the means of going. And of course, the linen in Cavan was a massive industry, particularly North Cavan, Killishandra, and a lot of skilled workers, linen workers, had come down from further north, and they had migrated, internal migration, and then abroad. So another thing, the places of origin in the county, and I'll just have a little map on that in a minute, remain consistent over time, and even long since this study has been finished, and as I refer to the ongoing study, the places of origin remain consistent over time. So the parishes, Killishandra, Anna, Drumgoon, obviously they are a bit bigger, so obviously they wouldn't focus anyway, but they do remain the same all the time. And then in the 1815 pre-famine, I call that just that pre-famine years, Protestants and Catholics almost equally distributed in the outflow. And very evident about chain migration, as Paddy mentioned earlier, the movement well underway before the famine. Just a few more findings. They went in family groups, single males, siblings, cousins, staged or gradual, where one went first to kind of smooth the pathway and brought out wives, children, and so on. The top destinations, obviously USA, Canada, Australia, Scotland and England. USA about 48% for Cavan. Canada, a lot more in the pre-famine years, but because the fares to Canada were cheaper, and then a lot of those people in Canada moved south to the United States to avail of other opportunities. Famine emigration, very diverse. And as I said, the advanced Cavan presence abroad, very evident, chain migration. And that's something that, in the study as well, the perpetuating nature of emigration. They didn't always have to go because of conditions here. I remember reading an article on the building of the Ballinamore-Ballyconnell Canal, and they couldn't get workers for it because everyone was gone. They couldn't even lift some of the crops because people were gone. This was in the 1860s, 70s period. I remember I think the bishop at the time, I can't remember which of them it was, Bishop Brown, or maybe after him, saying that he had too many priests. He had too many. It's the opposite now, but he had too many priests because he didn't have enough people to serve. He had too many people to serve and too many priests. Too few people to serve. Sorry. So these are the counties. Just the red is the pre-famine. So Templeport, Anna, as I said, the north of the county there, Kilmore, Killishandra, Drumgoon. Anna, I think, was the top sending in the pre-famine period, and then the blue and red in the post-famine. Now that doesn't mean they didn't go from every parish, because they did, but they were the biggest sending, and still. Concepta will know from her. Concepta is our researcher, and she knows every request that comes in here, so she will know that still to this day the same parish is turning up. Paddy mentioned moving from Armagh to Belfast and then to Seskinore. So we're just for a few minutes moving forward to the 1901 and 1911 census, because it gives this information. So it's interesting to note that 17,215 people in 1901 lived elsewhere in Ireland, actually in every county. No county was free of a Cavan person. Some of them very small. Waterford, I think, had just a few, some Church of Ireland clergymen. Obviously the biggest number to Dublin and Antrim, where Belfast is. I just find it interesting that there was 942 Leitrim people living in Cavan, but there was 1,074 Cavan. There was 1,074 Leitrim people living in Cavan, so there was more Leitrim people living in Cavan than the other way around. So they're all the bordering counties. I suppose the only one that's a little bit different is Armagh. And for the 1911, figures are much the same, and the only one there that's high enough, I think, is County Down. So again, Dublin and Antrim and Monaghan exceeds Leitrim this time. So they're all bordering counties, but it's just something else to think about when we think about migration. So then, just to get to the eve of the famine, I think this just sums it up pretty well. Bishop Brown to Cardinal Cullen in Rome. All our poor are suffering from hunger, and many are dying. The newspapers inform you of our present state, which is truly lamentable. What the end will be, no one can tell, and I believe no one has attempted to forestall. One thing appears certain, that the poor will be swept away by death and emigration. We are now carrying our people to the soup shop like beggars, as helpless and as prostrate a people as ever existed under the curse of Adam. So there's the state of the country, and even if Patrick's letter in 1841 hadn't told us, we know by then 1847 was a particularly bad year. So there's just a map of Ireland and the population decline. So you can see Roscommon, if Tommy was here now, I don't know whether he knows this figure, it's 32% I think for Roscommon, the population decline, so very, very huge decline in Roscommon. Cavan is 28%, but as Brendan said, some parts, and of course there was internal migration here too, where more people came into the towns, but 28% in Cavan decline between 1841 and 1851, so quite high. We're in that red, in that second lot there. And then just to look between 51 and 1920, and obviously you can see the 1850s, very big, and again Paddy referred to the equal amount of women and men, so it's almost equal right the way through. 1860s fairly bad there in the yellow, 1870s bad as well, or 1870s declined a bit, and then 1880s, a terrible decade in County Cavan, and probably in the whole of Ireland. A lot of mini famines in 1880, some very grim descriptions. So I think, Paddy, you might have had this slide, if I'm not mistaken, did you? I think it's a good description. It's a comment from Edward O'Donnell, who wrote "The Scattered Debris of the Irish Nation, the Famine Irish and New York City," and others. It was an essay in a book, and he called New York the swirling, expanding cauldron. And I think it's a very good image, the swirling cauldron. If we remember that between 1825 and 1845, a 20-year period, the population of New York rose from 166,000, if we think in New York today, it's hard to think back to then, to 371,000 in that 20-year period. And by the early 1840s, the Irish represented about 50,000 of people in New York. So, Edward O'Donnell says this city, into which was cast poor, mostly illiterate rural people, is describes the swirl is apposite for the swirling cauldron. So before the 1840s, the institutional network in New York included 2 newspapers, the Emigrant Aid Society, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, and 10 Catholic parishes with affiliated schools, orphanages and other societies. But yet Edward O'Donnell argues that social history that relies on measures of institutional growth is misleading, and closer analysis reveals that the poverty and discrimination faced by the majority of pre-famine Irish immigrants rendered these institutions barely able to cope. Paul Gilja argues that the middle-class institutions didn't reflect the day-to-day experience of the majority of New York's Irish, which experience took place in the streets and alleyways, where invisible bonds developed to tie the Irish Americans together. And there is just an alleyway from an 1887 photo. So to move on to, I'm not sure whether this is it wasn't 2019 because maybe it's 2020. I can't remember if they had a parade in 21 or 22, but it's our own CEO is there, Tommy, over to the right there, and our late beloved Kevin Smith is in the picture as well. So it's just a photograph from St Patrick's Day Parade of the Cavan P&B Society, the Protective and Benevolent Association of New York, and Michael Riley, who is the president, in fact I think he might be the president of all the county societies in New York. I was talking to him a few months ago at the launch of Cavan Calling actually, and he told me, I said, is there any evidence, any documentary evidence that the society was formed in 1848, in other words the oldest county society? And he says yes. He said they have an official programme for an annual ball celebrating its 35th anniversary in 1883. So because I've gone through the newspapers, both the Celt and abroad, the New York newspapers, and they do differ. Like some of them say it's the 40th anniversary ball, and then when it's the 50th anniversary ball, they don't match. The years don't match. So I haven't seen that document, but Michael assures me he has it. Unfortunately, there are no archives really from that early on. So they had their annual ball in Tammany Hall, and it lists a large committee with every parish in County Cavan represented. So there's just some clippings from the Evening World in New York, one from 1893 and 1888, County Cavan men on the floor. So I don't know whether that was from drink or whether they were about to dance, but it was advertising the ball, or it was announcing the ball. So no, there were plenty. That one was one is telling that the ball is coming up, and the other is reporting on it. So one 1888 and one 1893. So just again, Paddy mentioned. The Boston Pilot. There were ads for people that went missing in this swirling cauldron, and in all the swirling cauldrons around America, a lot of ads where people just simply, in the transition to the new world, they got lost. Maybe deliberately, some of them, or whatever happened to them. Now, there was one that I was fascinated with for a long time, and I've been doing research on her, Mary Farry, daughter to Edward Farry, native of Teresket, parish of Killishandra, came to America about 17 years ago. So this ad was in 1851, so she came about 1835 or thereabouts, and she wasn't heard from for 10 years. She lived near the city of Quebec. Any information respecting her will be thankfully received by her sister Catherine Farry. So lo and behold, not too long before that, that's them in 1840, the 1841 census, which is a wonderful census, and it's just such a pity we only have one parish surviving really in the whole of Ireland, which is Killishandra. The first page there is everyone that's out of the house, and the second page is everyone that's in the house. So you have Mary is there, and over at the side, the little bit I have highlighted, she's in America. The others are at service in Cavan. And the bottom of the thing says, this is the names of those who is, probably should be are, who is at service. So they're in Cavan, and she's in America. And then the great thing about it, it gives the mother, Bridget Dinnany, age 46, 46, and she died in 1837 she was asthmatic. So it's a fantastic census, gives wonderful information. So I, as I said, lo and behold, found Edward, the father, and two of his daughters arriving in New York on the 25th of August 1849. And Paddy again referred to the older emigrant. Well, who wants to go to New York at 78? But there he was. So the ad was placed a few years after that. So there was obviously, whether they went over to look for Mary or whatever. There may have been other ads about her, but I found nothing about her, nothing after that. So perhaps she died. Nobody knew who she was. I don't know, or maybe she didn't want to be found. But unfortunately, we didn't find her anyway. So just another one that was missing, I'm sure some of you here are familiar with the memoir of, again, Paddy referred to memoirs, which are great because they give information. Owen Peter Mangan wrote his memoir, and it's often cited in studies of Irish emigration. He was born in Knockbride in 1838, and it's quite a detailed record of his life from his childhood in Knockbride with his mother and stepfather to his emigration to England in 1853, his marriage to a woman from Kildare in England in 1856, and his move to relatives in America in 1869. And the memoir really is a lifetime of constant struggle and the extraordinary lengths that he went to from the time that he arrived in America. And I counted, he changed jobs 26 times, trying to better himself all the time. He brought his wife and children over. But just in relation to that brother of his, Terence, and I don't know who put the first ad in. His brother William put the first ad in, and then he put the second ad in as well 10 years later, one in 1861, one in 1871, and cousins are included. Again, there's genealogical information in a lot of these ads, so there's cousins included there, John James or Matt Cahley. So, but we learn from Owen's memoir. Owen mustn't have been aware, or maybe he wasn't in touch with William, but William actually Terence actually died of yellow fever in New Orleans in 1847. So he was dead before these two ads went in. But Owen, certainly his family came up in the world. I don't have a picture of him, but that's his grandson. So that's I just put that in. It's probably not fair to put somebody else, but it's the nearest I could get to what he might have looked like. And the Boston Globe, so he certainly came up in the world. There is Lynn, the morning wedding in Lynn, lifetime vows taken by Miss Catherine Mangan and Mr. George J. Curtin. So April the 26th. George J. Curtin, the Lynn correspondent of the Boston Herald, was united today in marriage to Miss Catherine M. Cecilia Mangan, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Owen P. Mangan, the ceremony being performed at St. Mary's Church. And it goes on then to talk about the gown that she wore, and the music just amazed me altogether. So the music of the Mass was Legiel's Kyrie, Gounod's Sanctus, and John Z. Kelly's the soloist, Carpenter's Agnus Dei, and Mascali's Ave Maria. So it was obviously quite a posh wedding. So, as I said, he certainly had come up in the world, Owen Peter, and that was his daughter's wedding. So just to go on to some of the stories, if these, Brendan did his talk on Glengevlin. Two of these, Mary on the left is from, well, they all lived in Latone townland. Mary, can you place Latone for us at all, Brendan? Can you give me an idea near the gap or where?
I've forgotten. I was actually told this the other day and I forgot.
You've forgotten?
Well, it's in the parish of Kilina, Mary.
Oh, it's in Kilina,
Yeah,
right.
Black Lion.
Oh, right, sorry.
An old shop.
Okay.
An old stone shop.
And Concepta did all this research on this family, and the file is that thick. There is a massive amount of information in it. It's one of those files that are good for that. And Art, the man who was doing the research and has been writing to Concepta there for years and years. So Mary was born in Latone about 1845. The records for West Cavan are quite late, so we didn't get an actual birth date, but these dates are based on dates of death. Cecilia and Bessie were sisters. Both lived in Swanland Bar. Their father died and the mother moved them and their several siblings back to Latone. So Cecilia and Bessie's sisters, and they were a first cousin of Mary. And we can see them there arriving in New York on the 16th of May 1861. So Cecilia, the first one there is not connected to them. Cecilia 18, Bessie 20, and Mary 16. So and again, the Cecilia and Bessie's father was known as Mickey Bren Wee, so I can only imagine it must have been yellow Mickey Brian or something like that. Or because there's so many McGoverns over there in West Cavan, they all have these nicknames. Probably Mickey of Yellow Brian. So he was killed. So. Really, the start of the Civil War, the Battle of Sumter, was barely over. A few weeks which heralded the start of the Civil War was barely over when they arrived in New York. So Mary's eldest brother Thomas had settled on a farm in Connecticut in the mid-1850s, and Mary when they arrived in New York, they didn't stay together. Mary went to Thomas in Connecticut, and the two sisters went to Boston, where they had two aunts living. So again, chain migration, somebody to go to. Cecilia is interesting because she obtained work and a lot of the information in this is from a diary that some of the girls, some of the sisters kept. Cecilia obtained work as a seamstress in the household of the author Nathaniel Hawthorne. He wrote The Scarlet Letter, was one of his more famous ones. He died about 3 or 4 years after that. But from the file, she seems to have got on very well in that household, and according to the oral history. And she also knew the author Louisa May Alcott, who wrote Little Women. Bessie, the other sister, worked as a cook in Boston, and over the next 10 years, 3 more of Bessie and Cecilia's sisters, Bridget, Margaret and Mary, joined them in Boston. And the interesting thing about Bridget is that Brendan was talking about Irish. A lot of them still spoke Irish, but Bridget in particular had no English at all, according to the file. So she was still learning English when she arrived over there. So that's the 1860s. So it is interesting. So then Mary married James Maguire in Wallingford, New Haven, Connecticut, where she was with her brother Thomas. And her parents, Frank and Mary, and 3 of the remaining children left for America. The youngest son, Patrick, remained in Ireland, or so I thought, until I tracked him down. And I found him in a census record with his family over there when they moved. So just briefly, they moved to Minnesota. Mary's father and his wife and 3 of his, well, they weren't children at that stage, they were quite big. they moved to Minnesota. So just to show you the map there, to show you how far away Minnesota is. And somebody asked the question earlier on about farming, Maura, I think it was. And certainly all of these people, all of these relatives of the Dolans, all went to Minnesota and all were farming and got on quite well. But what I wanted to just go back briefly to the three girls. They became very wealthy because of the grants were given. They were encouraged to go by the Catholic Church, and the railroads, of course, were there to get people to move. So they were given grants of land and bought and sold land. So they became quite wealthy and married. Cecilia and Bessie actually married two Dolan brothers to complicate the family history even further. So two Dolan sisters married two Dolan brothers, also from County Cavan. And but the thing that really was sad about it all is that between them they lost 13 children, and not just as babies, from 1 year up to 7. Between the whole lot of them, Cecilia had 11 children. Bessie's story is one of the saddest. She and Charles Dolan had 6 children in Boston. 3 of them died in Boston before the family moved to Minnesota. Another child, Susan, was born in Swift County, Minnesota, 1 month after her father Charles froze to death, while not far, very, very near his home, but the snow in Minnesota, they weren't long there at that time, so maybe just wasn't able to find his way home. And then she married a second time fairly quickly, and she had 2 more children again. 2 more died. So 13 children died of the 3 of them. So despite the land and the wealth, and the second man that she married, and I'm going to give a wee shout out here to Robert Golden, who might be watching in today. I can't tell if I just know Robert from emailing in about today's event, so I can't tell if he's any relation to this Philip Golden. But just to give you an idea of how much land and how they got on. This was Bessie's second husband. Philip Golden, one of the practical and successful, and this is from a compendium of history and biography in Minnesota. One of the practical and successful agriculturalists of Swift County, has been a potent factor in the development of the farming interests of the community in which he resides, and so on. He was born in the county of Cavan in 1854 and was the son of James and Susan McGovern Golden. And Golden, for anybody who might know, is a variant of McGoldrick. The father died when our subject was a child, and the mother still lives in Ireland. He received some schooling, blah, blah, blah. So he came to America in 1873, landing at Castle Garden, New York. He went direct to Boston, Mass., where he found work on the railroad, and left for Minnesota in 1876. Then it just said he moved to his present homestead in 1882 and has since added to his acreage until his present extensive farm was acquired. He sows about 100 acres in grain and devotes most of his attention to stock raising, 50 head of horned cattle, a score of sheep, 10 horses, hogs, etc. And he built his present comfortable dwelling in 1882. Mr. Golden was married at Fairfield, Minnesota, to Mrs. Elizabeth Dolan, formerly Miss Dolan, a sister of Mrs. Thomas Dolan, whose history appears elsewhere in this work. And he had a lot of land as well. So got on very well, but the tragedy, as I said, of losing the children. And this is just a nice photograph taken in California in the early 1900s of 2 of Mary's sisters, Bridget and Anna. And I think it's quite nice. They're obviously getting on in years, just holding hands there. It's a nice photo from the file. We just look briefly at Thomas Cruise, the Gold King, some of them called him. And he's going to be covered in Jonathan Smith's book, which has been launched tomorrow evening. Friday evening. The name of it just escapes me at the moment, but Tom will remind you what it is. And that just shows Thomas Cruise's father, James, there in the 1821 census in the parish of Drumlumman, townland of Lisnadara, in the 1821 census. And James was just 23 then. And Thomas was from that family. And that's his picture there. When the Drumlumman mine, which he named from his native parish, He's actually Ballymacue parish, but it is on for the census purposes, I think they're nearly the same. So this is the Drumlumman mine at Marysville, Montana. Marysville is a ghost town today, but when he sold it and subsequent shares thereafter, he made, I suppose, nearly $2 million at that time, which was a fortune. So became an extremely wealthy man. That's him on the top there, seated at his ranch near Lewistown, about 1898, and his mansion in Helena, Montana, early 1900s. But again, sadness for Thomas. His wife died just about 4 days after giving birth to their first and only child, Margaret Mary. And Margaret Mary herself dies about just age 27, just about a year before Thomas himself died. So again, despite all the money, a lot of sadness. The household at one time showed that he had a lot of nieces and nephews living with him, and then at one time he was living in the mansion on his own. He was very philanthropic, and every cause of the day in Montana he gave money to because he had lots of it. And you can see the cathedral there in the distance with the red roof. Sorry. I forgot how to use the pointer, Paddy. Sorry about that. There we go. And he gave a huge amount of money. It's a beautiful cathedral that's the inside of it. So, as I said, a very philanthropic man. So again, I thought Martin Donoghue was going to be here today. He's not here, is he? So I didn't see him anyway earlier. I just wanted to talk. I know Tommy referred to Ed Reevy, so I just included him. Ed Reevy, this is his father. They were in Philadelphia in the 1890s, and that's just some of the newspaper coverage of the license transfers. And I just find it strange that he bought a license in 1895, and a brewery license really, and sold it in 1896. And I wondered why. They came back to Ireland at all and went back again. But the fact that they lost a child too may have been a factor in their coming back to Ireland and in him selling the license selling the license just a year after getting it. So there they are coming back from Philadelphia. Well, from New York, even though they lived in Philadelphia, in January 1897, and he was a maltster, which was preparing the barley for the brewing. But he's on the manifest. He's now a wine merchant, so that's what he's down as. So you can see there he's there with his wife and John, James, Kate, and George, and here they are. Going back to Philadelphia, arriving in 1912. So he came back in 1897 and left Cootehill, and again in 1912, going back with an additional 2 children this time. Edward, age 16 there on the manifest. And then we get to the father was shot because a sentry warned him not to go any further, but he carried on, or he couldn't hear the sentry, and he was shot dead. So this was in 1917, and the sentry was going to be court-martialed. So again, going back to Philadelphia, he died in just 5 years after they went back. And then this is Ed's application for a passport in August 1922, and then we come to internationally known. He was 90 and lived when he died in 1988, and was world famous, of course. And Dr. Mick Maloney described him as no composer of traditional dance tunes in the history of Irish music has ever had his music adopted and played as widely as Ed. Is Bridge lady here, is she?
Yes.
Did I see Bridge here?
Yes.
Oh, Bridge is there. So Bridge knows all about this, and I know the people from Cootehill who organise this festival as well. He devoted much of his life to the creation of a vast body of compelling, finely crafted tunes, leaving an indelible imprint on the beautiful old tradition that was his first love. So that was just a little bit about Ed's life. Then another very sad story. I did two family histories for this particular family, Stevens, quite a while back, from two separate people. And it was a complicated family because it was the townland of Ahagegna in Crushala. There was about 6 families in Church of Ireland records. No maiden names are given, so all having the same names: Robert and Elizabeth and William and James and George and Richard and so on. It was very hard to distinguish one family from another, but they were all interconnected. So we look at James there. I have Susanna we look at James there. He's actually not aged 4 because he was born in age 21. In 1821, but George, his brother, is under 1, but it should be George that's age 4 because I have the baptisms of both those children. And the one that you can't see, it's something to do with the slide, has slipped on me, is Susanna, and she's very important in this story. So James married Sophia Bell on the 31st of July 1846. I'm sure it was a nice happy day. Sophia was about 12 or 13 years older than James. And I don't have a photo of Sophia, but her sister Mary was married to James's brother George. So this is a picture of her sister Mary to give you an idea. So James, anyway, Sophia, his wife, 2 nieces of hers came over to live with herself and James Stevens, Sophia Bell and James Stevens. And James took a little shine to Sophia. And he decided there was only one way around it: he'd get rid of the wife. So it's very sad, really. James Stevens, until recently employed as foreman in the carriage manufactory of Mr. Stevenson in New York, was arrested Tuesday, charged with poisoning his wife, who died very suddenly about a year ago. This Stevens is the man who was shot a few days ago by a young man named Robert Bell. So what happened was, James decided to slowly poison the wife. So he bought some arsenic and to poison Sophia, and she died very slowly. It took her several weeks. It's covered extensively, not just in New York papers, but in other papers throughout the United States. And I was actually at his father's graveside last night, because the father died at 101. And so James came from quite a big family, but he buried her very quickly. The 2 nieces were living with him, and but the nieces were suspicious, and they had a feeling she was poisoned. So how he was caught was, it was about a year later, and Robert, Sophia's brother, came over to take him on and to kill him for killing his aunt, Sophia. So Robert went to shoot him on the street, and James reported police. But when the case came round, they realised that James had actually, and they had her body exhumed. And you'd think after a year that she wouldn't show any arsenic, but there was massive coverage in the paper about the chemist analysing the body and all of that, and how they were able to find the arsenic, and the body was hardly decomposed apart from the head, but they were able to find the arsenic. But his sister Susanna, who I showed you there, it was blocked out in the 1821 census, and her husband decided to defend him and said that it was her husband who bought the arsenic and for rats. But when the body was exhumed and they found the arsenic, and he tried to escape as well. So there was a cartoon of the escape. It just says attempted escape of Stevens, the wife poisoner, from the tombs. The sheriff takes the pistol from him. So there's the New York Times, February the 4th, 1869, describing the hanging. And it goes into detail about how long it took him to die and all that. So just a terrible, sad story. So you just wonder, obviously the sisters, the 2 nieces wrote home for help, wrote home that they knew there was trouble. And I just wonder, when I did those family histories, there was absolutely no mention. I only discovered this by accident. There was no mention whatsoever of this that had happened to the family. So I wondered, because his father was still alive, so I wondered, how did it affect them at the time? Then again, this is just, I'm nearly finished now. The Shannon family from Drumlane all ended up in Kansas City. And again, after the war, after the Civil War ended, he had enrolled in the Union Missouri Militia. And after the war, he was elected mayor. The population of Kansas City was just over 4,000, but the town developed rapidly, so that by the census of 1870, the population had increased by more than 700% to 32,000. And his two brothers were there and his sister. But again, the three brothers all died relatively young, early 40s, from hard work really. And this is another one that I've been fascinated with for a long time. This is in the townland of Drumarton in Cootehill. Or Kill really, I suppose. The population had decreased by 43% in the 1841 to 1851 period. And reinforcing there's a board there called Quietude. We used to talk about that in class years ago, Paddy, about the quietude of the countryside when everybody was gone. And so it must have been terrible for Eliza to be there. This is Eliza Martin. So she arrived in Victoria, Australia. Some of her children had come back to bring her over. So she's arriving there in Victoria with her son George, his wife Eliza, two children and a brother Richard. And sorry, that's her arrival in 1860. That's the other children in 1857. And 3 years later she arrived. And she was 59 years of age. So again, an older migrant. There's Richard and there's George with I don't have a picture of Eliza herself. Again, a huge file with a lot of information in it. And the police she was admitted to the Yarra Bend Asylum at Merry Creek. And I thought just the sad thing, the supposed cause of her disorder, regretted leaving home, coupled with her recent desolate condition. 1862, but she died sometime after that. And then again, this is just a family that's going to be covered in Jonathan Smith's book, Mary Jane Hill and Robert Anderson. And another memoir. She wrote a memoir when she was in her 90s. And it's packed full of information. And she's talking about the day she left Ballyborough. I wanted to get away before the daylight so that I would not have to see the old home I was leaving forever. Her and Robert were going together. But it was a little later than I hoped when we started. The last thing I saw was father, mother and the children standing at the gate. I never saw them again except Margaret, who came to America after she married John Lucas, and Ellen, who was a widow with 5 daughters. She came to Sacramento, where I visited her after a lapse of 50 years. There was nothing familiar to me in her looks, but oh, how much we had to talk over. And I thought back to my mother meeting her sister, whom she left at the train station in Ballyhonus when her sister was just 19 and my mother was just 1 year younger. And she said, my heart broke in two. I'm even getting upset thinking about it. And when they met, I was there, I don't know what age I was when they met. It was probably sometime in the late 1960s. They just did nothing but cry. They cried for about 10 minutes. They didn't talk at all. And so I could just think about that. But just going back to the quietude, I see Doris, my good friend and neighbour, is here in the audience. I remember when and it's just a little memory that I had. When Doris' son left to go to Australia, she said to me, I miss Ronan hammering in the shed. And I was thinking about the quietude, and it was, again, going back to Patrick Cassidy at the beginning, it was very hard for people who were left behind, because the people that were going were busy getting on with their lives, but quite sad. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Don't know about you writing the drink.
It was a very hard slot, the one after lunch. trying to, I know well you had difficulty keeping awake, and I apologise, but sure.
I'd like to thank Mary for giving us that extensive background on migration and immigration from Cavan, and also for painting such a vivid and colourful picture of the various stories. Certainly, films have been made with a lot less information than that Stephen story. Anyway, have we any questions? Do we one or two?
Sorry,
Can I just ask you about the 1841 census for Killashandra? And that's a fragment that shows us what was destroyed. I mean,
Yes,
in many ways.
absolutely shocking.
Yeah, if you think of the implications of, you know, it is only a fragment, but it shows you the richness of, you know, potentially.
Yeah, I think it was even better, I don't know why, but I think it was even better than the English census at the time.
Yeah,
Considering that it was the one country.
yeah, exactly.
More detail, yeah.
Have people, anyone who died in the family in the previous 10
And what they died from. Yeah.
they died from.
Maura did an extensive study, I'll be talking about it tomorrow. 8 townlands in the parish of Killashandra. So Maura knows more about Killashandra than anybody else. Yes.
Is this archive available for us to research?
It's not, no, it's not, no. Because it's from people, but this, I said a lot of the information that I have given today is all publicly available anyway. A huge amount of the research on this is from newspapers abroad and our own newspaper as well. Yes.
Okay.
All the information that's found on the walls, on the boards, is that going to be made available?
Yeah, we're just getting a website done at the moment, and it's going to be on the website, yeah. It's a bit old now, but I suppose the history is still the same. Paddy says not. Yes.
Okay.
Just, you know, I just wonder, when there's so much immigration and the cities and towns expanded exponentially, how were they all accommodated?
Well, sure, well, sure, just
That 100% of an increase in
in Kansas City, yes, yeah.
where do they all live?
Well, sure, they built up with wood. There was loads of wood. They built up. Wouldn't that be it, Paddy? I mean,
Kansas is all flat land.
yes,
So there's tons and tons of space in Kansas, even now.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, just, you mentioned Golden and another variation of the name. I've Golden in my family, but they're Galway, and the Anglicization of that, no, the Irish version of Golden in Galway is Forkin.
Is what?
Forkin.
Falkland. Falkland. Oh, Forkin. All right. Okay. Okay.
And the same lady interchanged her name. She used to use in both versions.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Yes.
I've got a fair amount of information about my Cavan ancestors. You want me to send it?
Yes, we'd love that. Yeah, because the archive is expanding all the time. As I said, it's just, you can do so much with it. We haven't got it digitized or anything like that, but we have a database with every client is in it, and where in the county their people are from and all of that. So it's very easy to ask questions of it in that regard, but we just haven't got digitized the material. As I said, some files are just a couple of sheets, and some are huge, and some there's 2 or 3 for the one client. So yeah, a rich source. Yeah.
Any more? No. Okay. Thanks very much,
Yeah.
Mary, for that.
Just if Arthur wants to see how to use this, just.
Yeah. Friday evening here at 6 o'clock, it's called Faith,
Yes.
Hard Work and Endurance, Selected Tales of the Irish Diaspora. It really focuses on his set articles, and that's when it's been launched. Now, Arthur.
Sorry, I'm just going to get Catherine about the audio.
Okay.
Or is it okay, Jane?
It is, yeah, if you just put the microphone. Yeah, it is, it's okay.
It's okay. It's all right.
Good go?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Arthur is a journalist with the German public broadcaster Deutsche Welle, based in Berlin. He's based there for the last 7 years. He formerly worked in Ireland with GAA.ie. He's public relations officer with the Berlin GAA club and is a playing member of the team. Berlin were European senior football champions in 2019 and played here in the Leinster Junior Club Championship in 2020. Arthur, along with Lachlan Egan, George Cartwright here, Jimmy Finlay and others, were the prime movers in providing the John Joe Riley Memorial sculpture in the Market Square here in Cavan Town, the only example of its type in Ulster, and a fitting tribute to arguably Cavan's greatest sportsman. If you haven't seen it previously, go and have a look. And just also mention, as Tommy Ryan did, that George's book on the history of Breffni Park will be launched later in the week. Okay, thank you. Arthur is going to speak on A Parish Far From Home, the GAA abroad.
Thanks very much, Tom, and thanks also, I just want to say thank you to the library staff and Cavan Genealogy and everyone for putting this event together, and also thanks for putting me last on the bill behind 4 really terrific speakers. So unfortunately it's going to be tough to match up to Paddy and Brendan and Liam and Mary, but I'll do my best. So I'm just going to firstly explain this title, A Parish Far From Home, the GAA Abroad. I can't take credit for the phrase there that's used, A Parish Far From Home. That phrase comes from a book, which is actually one of the very few books that I'm aware of that's written on this subject by a journalist, an Irish journalist who's living in Sweden called Philip O'Connor. And he wrote that book about 12 years ago, a memoir of his time with the Stockholm Gaels, and it's called A Parish Far From Home. And it's a really interesting book if you're interested in sort of getting into this subject, where he just outlines kind of what were at that time the early days of, which I will get into soon, the European GAA. So that's where the title comes from. Now, I'm just conscious that there's possibly a few people here who may not actually know what I'm talking about when I talk about GAA. Maybe that's naive of me, but just on the off chance that there are some. The GAA itself stands for the Gaelic Athletic Association, which has been around in Ireland since 1884. Primarily a sporting body, but also a cultural one. Its main aims are to foster and promote Gaelic games, so hurling, Gaelic football, and rounders and handball, and also to a lesser extent, but still an important extent, Irish music, other traditions through its score, competitions, and in general to promote Irish culture. So that's the GAA. There's GAA clubs in every parish and every community in Ireland, and then there's county teams, which is the elite level of the GAA, where the very best players play. But the GAA abroad, so I think these two pictures here sort of capture a general sense of some of the things I'm going to talk about today. So on the left we just see a little boy there from Uganda. And we're going to talk a little bit today about, well, different types of diasporas, and it's already been touched a lot on in the various talks, and I know Paddy talked about it already, and indeed Tommy in his remarks this morning talked about that diaspora does not any longer just mean a group of people associated with one country. These little boys, for example, in Uganda are playing hurling now, and they have no ostensible connection to Ireland. That's part of that broad, inclusive diaspora we're going to talk about, which the GAA abroad has helped to foster. And then here on the right, we see a picture from, I think it's just a few weeks ago, or possibly at the end of last month. Those two lads are two native New Yorkers who were playing on a New York team which won the All-Ireland Junior Championship in Croke Park. Every single member of the team is from New York, a native New Yorker, which was an extraordinary achievement. And I mean, they weren't playing the very best inter-county teams, of course, but they were playing good teams from Ireland who were well able to play football. And just something that gentleman from Canada referenced earlier, which we talked about, the difficulty of perhaps finding that identity for second and third generations. I think it's something I will talk about. The GAA has certainly managed to do that in various ways. So now I'm just going to start with a little quiz for a few people. I don't know if anyone offhand recognises that scene there by any chance. I don't know if George, I'd say you possibly have been in its vicinity. But does anyone want to put up their hand and tell me where exactly that is?
Project New York.
It's New York, yeah.
Project Jackson.
Okay, well, I'll give you a clue. It's just west of the Harlem River, just south of Washington Heights.
Gaelic Park.
It's not quite Gaelic Park, but you're getting warmer. It's very close to Manhattan College. Well, I'll give you a clue. It's called the Polo Grounds Towers. Now that is, I took that picture from Google Street View, so that's very recent. That's what it looks like more or less today. But that is, roughly speaking, the site of this game. the 1947 All-Ireland football final, almost to the exact location. And I think for anyone who, who's a fan of the New York Giants or the New York Yankees and the New York Mets, the Polo Grounds has a whole particular meaning, and that stadium being demolished obviously was very significant for those fans, but it was also very significant for people from this county here, Cavan, and we can't really talk about, I certainly can't come in here and talk about the GAA abroad without first of all just talking about this occasion and what it meant. So this was the only ever All-Ireland final that was played abroad in the history of the GAA, in fact, obviously at the time, and there's been none since. And I should mention here as well the great local journalist Paul Fitzpatrick from the Anglo-Celt. If anyone wants to really find out about this occasion, Paul wrote a fantastic account of it called The Fairy Tale in New York a number of years ago, which is a really brilliant piece of work detailing what an occasion this was. And also I should mention at this point as well that we have, just when we're talking about Cavan GAA, the history of Cavan GAA in 1947, George has his book, which has been launched tomorrow night, I believe, which is detailing 100 years of Breffni Park, the stadium that some of you may have seen so far when you're here, or if you're locals, you're obviously well aware of it. And also the Breffni Gallery, which George is very involved in too, which is a really brilliant gallery and exhibition site at Kingspan Breffni Park, which goes through the history of Cavan GAA, and of course the Polo Grounds final is covered there, as it is in the County Museum. But just to get into really the significance of this occasion, I'm going to just move on now to this speech here, which from a man called Canon Michael Hamilton to delegates at the GAA Congress on what I believe was Easter Sunday 1947. Now, the build-up to the final had been held in New York, so there was a remarkable character who's worthy of his own lecture series called John O'Donnell, known as John Kerry O'Donnell, who basically ran New York GAA like his own personal fiefdom for many, many years, was constantly getting into rows with the central authorities of the GAA back here in Dublin. I mean, on one occasion, he took the Sam Maguire himself when it was visiting New York and confiscated it just to cause devilment and create problems for someone. So that was the kind of character he was, but also without him there would be not the New York GAA that we know of. But he wanted to bring an All-Ireland final to New York because he saw that at the time, by the late 1940s, what had been an extremely strong Irish community in New York, which had driven the GAA, and which in fact throughout New York's history the ebb and flow of Irish migration directly contributed to the size of its GAA community. He saw that by the 40s it was beginning to dwindle. There hadn't been as much migration as there obviously had been in the previous years, and so he was pushing for this, and he had a very powerful and influential advocate in this Canon Michael Hamilton from Clare. And I just thought his speech was really extraordinary, some of the things he touched upon it. I mean, he made this speech to Congress, and the decision, I say Congress, that's the GAA decision-making body, where on an annual basis the delegates would decide how things are going to be done. And before this motion was brought, the motion to have an All-Ireland final played in New York, it was seen as having no chance of passing through. The logistics of bringing it to New York were seemingly insurmountable. There was significant opposition. But he made a number of remarks which clearly swayed the delegates. Are you going to deny them this little piece of Ireland? I could not attempt to express what an All-Ireland would mean to our exiles. Hundreds of thousands of them awaiting this decision of Congress, and if that decision is in their favour, there will be a wave of joy and happiness in the homes of our exiles, not in New York, but all these other places in the States. And then we see there further down, talking about people and the thousands among them who had been living in New York who would feel they would die happy if they saw their native county playing in an All-Ireland final. And then perhaps the killer piece, which I believe was impromptu. This is the year 1947, the centenary of that dark and dismal period when, hunted by the spectre of famine and pestilence, the great exodus of our people found a friendly welcome and warm hospitality on America's shores, referring of course to Black 47, the most infamous year of the Great Famine. And then again, the last line there that I have, the wonderful tenacity of our race, connecting the GAA with Irish ethnic identity, which has been a long and often controversial element of it, but which I will try to point out throughout this brief talk that has changed significantly. But nonetheless, at that time, a very, very powerful calling card. And it swayed the delegates, and it succeeded in bringing the All-Ireland final to New York. And indeed, just a brief thing here, and George, you may know if this story is true or not. Micheál Murchahurtig, the famous Irish broadcaster, a few years ago he's now in his early 90s, but he knew a lot of the Polo Grounds players, and he was talking about how in latter years in their lives they always, the guys from Cavan and Kerry would talk about the Polo Grounds match. And a sort of a reverse nostalgia almost took over. A match that had been aimed at sort of bringing a piece of home to the Irish community in New York. This occasion ends up forming a part of, I think, home identity to these players who were at their athletic peak and had their finest hour. I mean, Cavan won the All-Ireland that day, out here on this field in New York. And Micheál Murchadharthaigh said that in 1997, when they went back to New York, many of the players, now old men, for an anniversary match between Cavan and Kerry, they wanted to be brought to that place I showed you earlier, to the site of the Polo Grounds, and that they were very disheartened and disappointed to see that it was gone, that this perfect place, I guess, of the high point of their lives was now replaced by those skyscrapers. Now, just very briefly, before I really get into the broader context of the GAA abroad, I just do want to take a little look at how New York sort of symbolises and is a good prism through which to look at the GAA as a whole. So Paddy and all our distinguished scholars here can verify this, but I think it's true to say that in 1855, close to 1/3 of the population of Manhattan was Irish born. So it gives you an understanding. Obviously, Mary touched on New York and that melting pot, the swirling cauldron, as she put it, of just how many Irish people were in this city. And so it's understandable that there was, even pre the foundation of the GAA in the 1850s, there was a hurling and football club had been established in New York. And we see this across North America, in fact, in Canada and in other cities in the States. There was evidence of the games being played by the diaspora before the actual GAA itself had been officially founded in Ireland. So these exiles did bring these games with them, particularly hurling, because unlike Gaelic football, which sort of evolved somewhat differently as a codified sport, hurling was very much a real game that was played in its current form in many respects. And New York GAA, founded in 1914, but Gaelic Park, which still is, as we see here, there's a recent picture, was purchased in 1926. So it's also like Breffni Park coming up to its centenary, and it's an iconic location in terms of overseas GAA, and we have seen through New York teams playing every year in the All-Ireland Football Championship the significance of that place. And also to any person, Irish person who's been to New York over the years, either to live there or visiting family, Gaelic Park may have formed a part of that experience. But as I said earlier, by the 40s, GAA on the decline in the city with less Irish immigrants to play. Now, as I said, the Polo Grounds final was brought there. It obviously, its aim was to give a boost to that community. And whether it did or not is not entirely clear, but we know by the 50s there were far more Irish people again coming. And New York GAA has gone through various stages of boom and bust. At one point there were over 60 clubs in the city. It's now down to the early 40s. But just to move it forward to the present day, New York GAA in 2023, so I mentioned that team made up entirely of native New Yorkers that won that All-Ireland Junior Championship. And also earlier this year, we saw a remarkable result. The New York team, they beat Leitrim, the Leitrim senior football team, the team that represents the very best footballers in Leitrim. They beat them in the All-Ireland Championship match, an annual game that is played from the Connacht Championship in New York. It's been going on for over 20 years. No New York team had ever beaten them. This year they beat them with several native sons of New York on that team as well, including the two Brosnan brothers, whose father I think is from Kerry, living in New York for years, but has instilled in them the love of GAA, appreciation of it, like many communities now around the world, particularly in North America, where these native children are taking up the games. And just a reference to it here from a selector from the team. One lad on that team who had never set foot in Ireland before. This is the team that won the All-Ireland Junior Championship. His first trip to Ireland, he's after winning an All-Ireland medal. You can't beat that. Every one of them is born and bred in New York, every single one of them. They've gone through the whole minor system over there. So there is now a youth setup in many of these communities. So I just wanted to go through the New York story, first of all, as a way of getting into the broader story, because New York in many ways is the ultimate sort of beacon of the overseas GAA, I would say, both its downsides and its good sides, because often New York has been affected by falls in migration, but now it's in a place where the game and the culture around it is so strong that it's largely an Irish-American organisation. You don't need new people coming over from Ireland to maintain it. It exists now on its own spirit. Now, I'm just wondering, can I play this? 1 second. I hope I can. Yeah. So, just to finish on this little New York section, I think it's always a good measure of the power of an idea or its appeal when Guinness makes an ad about it. And that's the same with other big Irish brands, like we said Kerrygold or other things like that. And we've seen Irish migration has regularly formed a theme in these advertising campaigns. Now I'm just going to show you this very short ad, which I think you'll get it when you see it. So I'm just going to play it here.
I told you, you know he's an old man. Can't help out at you. Forget it. Sure. You're open. Could be a long time before they make a final again, Pops.
It was a Cavan flag, or Cavan scarf, I don't know if you noticed, so maybe, who knows. So yeah, I mean, let's hope it's not a draw. He doesn't want to have to get tickets again for the replay. But yeah, so that's the New York angle. But now, just before I get into the broader story, so first of all, the GAA abroad, it's not just New York, obviously, and it's not just North America. And who exactly are we talking about? It's not just Irish lads or Irish girls who've just flown over who are playing. There's a very broad community now are playing these sports abroad. And also, what can we learn about the story of modern Irish migration in particular, because that's mostly what I'll be focused on here, from looking at how the GAA abroad works in this year, 2023. So, what's referred to as units typically in GAA kind of speak, you know, we have, in Ireland here, we have our clubs and our county boards, and then our provincial councils. So the club is obviously the main unit, so that could be Crushala or Cornafane or Killashandra or whatever the club is. And then you have Cavan as a county team, and then you have the Ulster Provincial Council. But the way the global GAA is structured, and I think this is part of my own opinion, is why the GAA succeeds so well abroad, is because the structure is so clear. The basis upon which it operates in terms of the home country is so clear that it gives communities abroad a template by which they can set up shop, they can operate in various communities that are very different culturally, but which feed back always to the mothership in Croke Park, where there's a rules-based system and a structure by which you can kind of be connected. So you feel like no matter how casual your club may be, there is this sort of pathway back in terms of your structure. Now, just these are the various international units. So we have the USGA over there. I'll go through them all shortly individually. New York, Europe, Middle East, Britain, Australasia, Canada, and Asia. And just to go through them all separately. So the biggest one by far, and the oldest actually, is the British GAA, understandably. It's actually not a county board, it's a provincial council. It's the only provincial council that's outside of Ireland. So the four provinces, obviously Ulster, Leinster, Connacht and Munster, are the councils which coordinate those four provincial structures in terms of the teams. But Britain has such a big base of clubs to operate, it's treated as a provincial council. And that comprises Scotland, Yorkshire, these are all county boards, so a lot of clubs within these places, Lancashire, Warwickshire, Hertfordshire, Gloucestershire, and then the biggest one of all, London. So Britain was founded in 1927, clubs 89. Now I said Britain's the oldest, and it's not that the council itself is the oldest, but the oldest is London GAA, which makes Britain effectively the oldest. So founded in 1896, at that time and in the years immediately after its founding, it was also a very important sort of breeding ground for the Irish Revolution. A huge amount of people who became prominent in the Irish Revolution met in GAA clubs in London, developed contacts and connections through them, and it was a way which structured and organised the Irish community abroad at that time. So at the moment there's 30 clubs in London, a very, very strong team. I mean, it's hard to emphasise, I think, to people how good these players are at counties like London and New York. They're more than able to compete with teams from Ireland, which is amazing when you consider the differences in resources. County teams nowadays in Ireland are operating at effectively a professional level or very, very close to it. It's really elite sport, and these teams are well resourced enough and have a broad enough and long established enough community that they can largely compete with them, or certainly very close to it. London reached the Connacht final, for example, in 2013 and continue to win games against county teams, so that makes them quite unique. They're the only one who really can do that. Now, just to go through some of those, we've obviously been through New York GAA, founded in 1914, around 40 clubs, which I think, George, would, am I right in saying, would put it equal to Cavan? I think there's a similar number of clubs in Cavan. So that gives you an idea of the size. Now, okay, it's New York City, it's not Cavan, but still, that they're able to have such a large community of clubs that it's equal in number to a county like Cavan says it all about how big it is over there. The USGA, so this is for the rest of the United States, doesn't include New York. Very, very large community as well, and it's not just places like Chicago and Boston you now have hurling and football clubs in places as diverse as Nashville, Fairfax, Virginia, the Cayman Islands, not of course necessarily the US, but part of the USGA, Philadelphia, Richmond, Virginia, 70 or 80 cities, I believe, and now over 100 clubs. And one of the big things about the USGA now is I think close to 50% of the players are non-Irish. When I say non-Irish, I should make myself clear, I don't mean they're non-Irish, they're non-Irish born. So they are second, third, fourth generation, or something else, which is again something I'm going to come on. That's another big thing. It's no longer about your Irish identity. It's just, in some respects, a community identity or a sporting identity. Australasia GA was the next one to be founded. That's covering Australia and New Zealand. So 50 odd clubs founded in the mid-70s. Canada itself used to be part of the USGA board, but as they got more and more clubs, its own county board was set up. They currently have 28 clubs, but these numbers are quite fluid. Clubs are coming into existence all the time. Mostly it's a rising number. Gaelic Games Europe, and this is the one that I've personally been most acquainted with through my years living in Berlin. Founded in 1999 with just 4 clubs, and it's by far the fastest growing unit with 108 clubs. So it's a particularly interesting one, I think, Europe, because a lot of the places we've already mentioned are obviously very closely associated with patterns of Irish migration. Continental Europe is not so much. And so we have seen a sort of a different type of GA become established in these cities, still very Irish-based, but also extremely diverse. And I will touch upon that now shortly as we get to some individual stories. Asia GA, also a very, very interesting example. We have clubs now, for example, in Bangkok, Beijing, Macau, New Delhi, Jakarta, Busan in South Korea, Malaysia, Saigon in Vietnam, Taiwan, the Taiwan Celts. There's clubs now really all over the world, as we can see through these units. And then the most recently formed county board as such, the Middle East GA, very much a product, I would say, of the post-financial crash period of migration. There was GA in the Middle East for years because of building and construction over in that region, but it really became big time in the last decade when you had not just people in that sector, but people from teaching, nursing and all sorts going over to the Middle East. And some of these clubs are also extremely strong, but still I would say this unit is a very Irish unit, still Irish born and often more temporary migrants rather than some of the other units. And now I should actually also mention, while we're just talking about this, the GA World Games. So this week, actually, as we speak in Derry, a couple hours north of here, this event is taking place, the GA World Games, and this event was brought in a few years ago by the GA as a way of recognising this growth that I've just been talking about, the extent to which these units have been springing up around the world. There's been a 100% growth in the number of GA clubs in the last 10 years, so it really is exploding to an extent. And so these teams, this picture is just from the other day. Some of the girls from Berlin GA sent this to me. This is the German ladies football team. So these are all German or non-Irish girls. There's a couple English girls in there, there's a Spanish girl, but they're common. What binds them together is they're all living in Germany, they're all non-Irish natives, and so they took up Gaelic football sort of as non-native players, as it were. And there's teams like this of all kinds playing in these World Games in Derry, whether they're living abroad or they're actually representing a country where they're from. And it's a really wonderful event. And what is amazing to me always is the enthusiasm and the love that these people who aren't Irish, may not even have been to Ireland, may not even care that much about Ireland, but they love the sports and they love the sense of community and home that these clubs do undoubtedly represent to them and to people abroad when they come together and form them. Now, who exactly are we talking about? Now, before I say any more on this, I'm just going to play this little video for you, so we can shatter, I suppose, our preconceptions that we may have about what the GA abroad is. Now Limerick will have their eye on him. But so that there is a match from a couple of days ago between the Kayunga Silverbacks and the Bugembe Gembe Falcons. And that is Uganda. And that's off a highway near Kampala, the capital of Uganda. And this club is really remarkable because it was only started a couple of years ago by two guys from Uganda with zero connection to Ireland. No Irish person influenced them in setting it up. They discovered the games on TikTok and YouTube. They saw them, they saw hurling, they saw football, and they thought, this is very interesting. One of them's a PE teacher. And they thought, okay, it'd be maybe a good way of getting girls into sport, because they say that in Uganda there's a problem sometimes getting girls to play team sports, as it is in many communities. And they noticed that they saw a lot of ladies' games as well, and they just loved the sports, and so they started introducing it. Now, the problem was they were playing with mahogany sticks, which was breaking a lot of backs. So they got attention, I suppose, through these kind of videos, and then the GAA has got together to provide them with hurls, and it was logistically very difficult, but they now have a lot of original cool tech equipment, schlitters and footballs and jerseys and so on, and it's a very vibrant and growing community there in Uganda. And they're getting very limited influence from the Irish community there. It's not that it's a very big community either, just a bit of sort of, I suppose, moral support from a few Irish people on the ground there, but it's an entirely native development that's happened there. And that's just, there's not too many Uganda GAAs, but it is an example of how we can have a certain perception in mind when we think of the Irish diaspora, but to me that's part of the Irish diaspora. And those kids have probably never heard of Ireland, but they are part of it now through what has been exported, whether it's through people bringing the games or digitally, like I said, on TikTok and so on. Now, this just brings me on to this here. So, two diasporas. The Irish diaspora, whether that's someone like me, perhaps someone like the children of Irish migrants who've gone to New York or gone to Canada or wherever it is, and then the affinity diaspora, which really covers a much broader range. And this term, affinity diaspora, people who have an affinity to a place but who may not necessarily have any family links to the place, may never have even been there, but for whatever reason are connected to it. Now that's a very broad encompassing number. Now this picture here is from some of my teammates from Berlin GAA when we played in the Leinster Championship in 2019, and from left to right it's Jan, Josh, Rowan and Mitch, and all four of those guys are Australians. Absolutely as Australian as the day is long. They had, three of them had never even been to Ireland before, and it's funny, the two guys there in the middle, they're 6'6" and 6'5" respectively, and I remember the team we played from Longford who beat us in the end, they said that after the game, you know, they had been doing their research and that they were aware of a couple of hairy Australians in the middle who needed special watching. But yeah, like these lads all play with the Australian rules team in Berlin, which is also a diaspora community, a strong one, which is connected through their sport. But we developed a link with them, I think, because of our shared experience as exiles, which is again one of the big things I've experienced being part of this community, is often what connects you to people in situations abroad is not just that they're Irish or not, but that you have a common experience as exiles very often. And that's particularly the case I find nowadays. It's much more fluid. People are not necessarily going to be, you know, wearing their green jersey on St. Patrick's Day and, you know, banging the table for Ireland, but that they're proud of their Irish identity in a more maybe understated way, where they like to connect through sport and through other ways and share it with other people. And I think these guys on that particular occasion really represented that for me. They were great players, great athletes, but also brought their own unique Australian way of doing things. I remember this guy here on the right, Mitch. You can see his cheeky smile. I remember in the final, in the European final, which we won, that got us to this match, he was sledging the other team like I have never seen. You would not see in an Irish pitch. When the free taker was taking his frees, he was in his Australian accent, just little cuts saying, the last one went left, the last one went right, I don't know where this one's going. But they brought their own unique way, is what I'm, I guess, trying to say, into it. And just before we get into, I suppose, the broader question of the Irish diaspora and the GAA, this is a graphic I just have from a Pew Research study, which is a few years old at this stage, but I think it is still broadly accurate, you know, roughly showing where Irish diaspora people themselves are, people who have either born in Ireland or who are connected to people born in Ireland. And you can see the darker the colour, the stronger the population. And so we do see a correlation between this map and GAA clubs and where they are. And so when we talk about the Irish diaspora playing, it is important to bear this in mind. That is definitely a big factor in where clubs are strongest. And now the case study, Berlin GAA, so the club that I have been most involved with. You know, over the years we've had we've had good teams that have done things like one that got to that Leinster Championship match, which was obviously very much founded on a lot of Irish players. But we also have had over the years Iraqi refugees playing with us, an Israeli guy who's very passionate playing with us, all the Australian guys. And on the girls' side, on the ladies' side, it's an even more diverse bunch between native Germans, Americans, people who just came down to training because they saw it happening and just liked the sports. And so we have seen this sort of evolution of the types of backgrounds of people, and it's now at the point where it's really no longer, we couldn't call ourselves an Irish community anymore. We are, of course, but it's much, much broader. I think we aim to be an inclusive migrant sort of place, but also for German people if they want to play, and likewise in America and these places. It's a sporting community which I guess is particularly geared towards migrants, but really to anyone who likes the sports and likes that sense of home. And it's just something, I think, Paddy, in your lecture you talked about home, that sort of that's the central place that it has in this whole conversation. I think for a lot of us, the GAA club and in these communities abroad has become a home for so many people. It has become a very well-organised home, because often when you do move abroad there is a chaos in the early days. You don't know where you're going to live, you may not necessarily have work. In the past there was obviously letters, now it's all WhatsApp groups where there's instant communication for newcomers to the clubs, and where we can all help each other much quicker get settled into these communities, and that is really across the board in Australia, the US, everywhere. It's a big selling point, I think, of these places. There's lots of people who, I think in the past, Irish migrants who would have went abroad wouldn't have wanted to go near the GAA club because they would have associated it with maybe an older form of migrant, maybe a bit narrow-minded in their perception. They might have thought, well, then I'll only stay with Irish people. But I think that's very much gone. And just this is something that I thought was good from an article that was written about the club a few years ago. Berlin GAA might be a good example of the modern phenomenon of GAA clubs putting down roots on rocky soil outside of Ireland and quickly blossoming. But when you really get to the essence of it, you realise that their story is the oldest and purest GAA narrative of them all. Most GAA clubs in Ireland are now so long established that we have no real appreciation for the effort it took to get them up and running. The early setbacks that might have sunk the whole enterprise had a few diehards simply refused to quit. The milestone victories, big and small, on the pitch and off it, that fostered the unity and spirit now taken for granted. And then at the end there, the sparks that led to a sporting bushfire in Ireland in the late 1800s and early 1900s are now beginning to be struck again on foreign soil, and that is absolutely tallies with my experience. And now I'm just going to finish with a few personal examples, just to sort of, I suppose, get into some of the personal stories behind some of the people who are now involved in GAA clubs. So this girl, young woman, Lisa Goodman, who I've known well in my time in Berlin GAA. So at the very start of this clip, you may not just hear what she says because it just got cut off at the wrong time, but the very first thing she says is that she never played when she was in Armagh. So she's from Armagh, from a Catholic background in Armagh, but grew up in quite a divided and sectarian town, Craigavon, which suffered particularly badly during the Troubles and is still quite divided along sectarian lines and political lines between Unionists, Protestants, Catholics, Nationalists. And a lot of people, like Lisa here explains, didn't necessarily want to be affiliated in any way with anything that was going on at that time, and she explains how that influenced her original sort of sporting story.
Back when I lived in Armagh, I only started playing GAA when I got to Berlin around 6.5 years ago. I didn't play actually because I grew up in quite a sectarian area, I would say, and my parents really wanted to keep me away from anything that was going on at the time. And we went, me and my sister, my family, we lived in quite mixed areas, and I also went to integrated schools. So my school didn't have GAA, and the local GAA club actually had many players that went to the Catholic school, and I didn't really know them, so I didn't really ever feel like I belonged there.
Okay, so as she explains there very clearly, the reasons why she didn't play growing up. But then Armagh won the All-Ireland Football Championship in 2002, as she explains, and she saw that and became sort of more interested, but still it was not something she wanted to play. But then she moved to Berlin, and she saw it as an immediate and obvious starting point for her to communicate and connect with other Irish people. So she did join the club, and she became very, very involved, both as a player and off the field. And she ended up, I don't know if she mentioned it in this clip now, but she did end up becoming the chairperson of the club, and a really fantastic asset to any club, if any club in Ireland or abroad would have her. And she just explains here how her time with Berlin GAA influenced her overall Irish identity. And I found it very interesting in the context of the fact that she had never played it at all in Ireland. And so it's an illustration of just how powerful it is when you move abroad.
Being part of the GAA abroad has actually helped me explore my Irish identity much more. Growing up in Northern Ireland, I didn't really feel like I was Irish enough, or completely Irish, if that's a thing. It was probably one of the reasons as well that I didn't also want to play at home as well. But I think now that it has made me be more confident about my nationality and about my identity, and that I'm not afraid now to say that I am Irish. But I would say that being part of the GAA has changed a little bit my relationship with, of course, Northern Ireland itself, for sure. I feel like I have become part of a bigger community. I've become more of part of an Irish community, a more open and more diverse community, compared to what it was like in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, so I think a good illustration of how it can transform your own relationship with the place, and likewise people who've had no connection with Ireland, which I'll come to now shortly. Now, we mentioned here the affinity diaspora, so I just found this quote which I thought was interesting from a Scottish government document which was actually looking at how Ireland had approached its diaspora and how Scotland hoped to learn from it. So an affinity diaspora is a collection of people, usually former immigrants and tourists or business travellers, who have a different national or ethnic identity to a nation state, but who feel some special affinity or affection for that nation state, and who act on its behalf whilst resident in the state after they return home or from a third country. So I definitely think that can be applied to lots of people who are part of this overseas GAA. And just to give you a few examples that I can think of even from Cavan, I know a boy who was involved with us in Berlin, a German lad who went to school in Belturbet for a few months, did a school exchange programme, and then joined Berlin GAA when he came back. Another lad who went to Carlow, Jakob is his name, went to Carlow for a few months, came back and set up his own hurling club, which is now quite strong in the city of Darmstadt in Germany. All Germans, all just simply love hurling. These kind of people, part of this affinity diaspora. But another really fascinating group, I think, in this whole conversation, maybe the most fascinating of all, are two regions of Europe, Galicia in Spain and Brittany in France. So this team that I've taken a picture of here, A Coruña Fillos de Breogán, I think it's how it's said anyway. Certainly this part, the Irish name at the end, I'm not sure quite how that's said, but so in Galicia and in Brittany, they have a strong Celtic identity. Now I know it's disputed to an extent, particularly in Galicia, exactly what that means or how Celtic it is. What's undeniable though is that they have their Celtic traditions. In terms of the migration patterns, I'm certainly not the person to say, but it's not entirely clear what the patterns were, and it is much disputed. But nonetheless, in Galicia, they are very, very proud of their Celtic identity, and there are more clubs in these two regions of Europe by far than any other part of Europe, with the exception of Ireland and Britain. So in Galicia, there's a dozen clubs, all more or less native Galicians, and in Brittany it's the same. And they just have all sprung up over the last 20 years through this Celtic identity that they have. They just feel whatever it is about these sports connects them to that identity in some way, and as a result, they are now the two strongest areas of growth in the European GAA. And I just want to finish with a really nice story here from this couple, which I think sort of captures it. Now, I'll let them tell their story themselves, first of all, before if there's any context required, but just in case you don't quite catch it. The lad on the right there is Dani Garcia, who's from Galicia. The girl on the left is Camille from Paris, and they now are both living in Zurich. And they're just going to tell a little bit about how they, first of all, got into the GAA.
Hi, I'm Camille Taylor. Hi.
Can you hear them?
Sorry. Please.
high as it goes, unfortunately.
You put it down there, put it up another bit.
Seeing if this comes back. Okay, I think it's as loud as I can get it.
Hi, I'm Kevin Taylor.
Turn on the microphone towards the laptop.
Yeah. Paris, France.
Where's that, sorry?
You just want to push this kind of down towards the laptop.
Oh, gotcha. Oh, I understand. Okay, thanks. Ah, that's too low. Okay, well look, I can tell you their story anyway. So, Camille was from Paris, spent a brief bit of time in Ireland, and through sort of, friends, started playing the games there. Danny was from Galicia and played soccer, but didn't really like soccer very much, and then noticed that some of his friends were playing this new sport, Gaelic football, and got more and more into it as a result. And they both started playing in their respective places, Camille in Paris, Danny in Galicia, and then they both moved to Zurich, and they become so immersed in it that they ended up serving on the committee of different clubs. And they got married, having met at the GA convention, European convention, and are now starting a family together, all through the GA. And this is increasingly my experience of this community, that it is people from all over the place with no direct connection to Ireland, but who, for whatever reason, are part of this affinity diaspora and do feel this connection to part of our cultural story, the GA. I want to just finish then with this. So, part of this, this is the story of Argentina GA, which is really quite a touching, I think, way to finish this whole area, and again, which touches on some of the points that were raised earlier about, how connected the children of immigrants may feel, or so on, to the home country, or to their parents or grandparents' home country, or further back, and how that identity can still be retained. And so this is from the World Games in Abu Dhabi in 2015. Now, we obviously know there is an Irish-Argentine community that stemmed up through that very intense period of migration from Ireland to Argentina, I think from the sort of 1830s right up until the early 20th century. And a lot of people from the Midlands and from the southeast of Ireland went to Argentina. Now, this was the Argentina Gaelic football team after winning the World Games for non-Irish players. They had just beaten Galicia, who I just talked about, in the final. And this is an interview with a guy from the team. Just the very first few seconds is a Cavan man there, Egon Farrell, presenting the Argentina captain with the cup. And we just see them celebrating. But then we move into an interview with a man called Bernardo Devereux Lynch, who just illustrates how special and important playing these sports is to him. And I hope you can hear this one.
Well, it's like, I don't know, like a gift to our ancestors. They played this, they didn't have the chance, most of them didn't have the chance to go back to Ireland, didn't have the chance even to play in Ireland. And we had the chance, after 2 generations, to play again, go back to Ireland again, play a final, then come to Abu Dhabi and win a GA tournament, a real GA tournament in Argentina. So it's like a gift that we are giving to our grandfathers. It's unbelievable. My father's a very sport. He plays hockey in the national team, so he is fanatic of sports. So his uncles, he played hurling in Argentina the years they played. So knowing that we won this championship would be amazing for him also. He would be really proud that one of his sons representing the Irish connection to Argentina and playing that this way and winning a championship. It's unbelievable. Yeah.
And your grandfathers?
They're seeing it from the sky. Probably very proud.
Yeah, I just thought that was a very touching way to put it. They're seeing it from the sky. And you would not necessarily think, when you think about the GA, of a third generation, I think possibly a fourth generation Irish, the son of Irish migrants in Argentina, feeling that connected to this identity And I just think it shows the power of the GAA. I don't think I have an answer as to what it is or why it is, because there are other sports which are great, there are other clubs which are great, but for whatever reason, the GAA abroad has flourished and continues to really flourish and has evolved from being perhaps a very different organisation in terms of the places that it took root originally to what it is today. And there's currently around 500 clubs abroad, and I think that number is going to really continue to grow in the years ahead and continue that story of the Irish GAA abroad. So thank you for your time today.
Thanks very much, Arthur, for giving us a history of the GAA abroad and also the current development of the game abroad, the current state of play and its link with diaspora, etc. Now, anyone have any questions for Arthur?
I studied in San Francisco, and he went out to San Francisco as a single man and met a Tipperary woman in the GAA clubs over there. The 3 children play for the GAA, and he's working for a ex-county Cavan player for the past 11-12 years, because as soon as he joined the GAA, of course, he made friends and he got a job.
Yeah.
He worked for the same company, all through GAA.
Yeah, oh, it's absolutely massive for those kind of connections.
They say every time somebody new comes out, they say, she's from Tipperary, where are you from yourself?
Yeah, I think a very common story,
Yeah, they identify them.
Yeah, absolutely.
George.
Thanks, Arthur, for a fascinating lecture. It's just worth pointing out as well, Arthur, and you'll be familiar with this, huge sacrifices that so many volunteers make abroad. You take, for example, in Canada, take in Asia and take in Europe, how sparse clubs are and the distance between clubs, and we've known of teams that had to go travel on an airplane for 4 or 5 hours to get a game, even a challenge game. And while they do come together for tournaments, etc., just to get a challenge game, particularly in Canada, I know of teams that would have to travel maybe to Vancouver or whatever else, different places. And I suppose the fact now that clubs are increasing, there's more opportunities for games, but certainly 20, 30, 40 years ago, that would have been the situation.
Absolutely. I mean, in Berlin, the nearest club we have to us in strict geographical terms is Warsaw, which is a 6-hour drive away, in terms of a football team. There's other clubs in Germany, but they're all very far away. There are hurling teams which are a bit closer. But not only that, George, but also the resources, the lack of resources we have to find a pitch, to find an adequate pitch to play on. I mean, let alone to have GAA goals. I mean, on a good day we get WAV and piping and stick it on the goals if we have the time and the inclination. But most days we don't even bother doing that because it's too much hassle. So yeah, not only in terms of the amount of time. Like for example, in New York, when you're playing for the New York County team, the amount of a commute you have to go to training, which is why I emphasise their achievement in winning that. But yeah, I think it's hard to sort of explain the lag in resources and opportunity we have to play, and so that passion does need to be more than at home. Yeah, they don't know how lucky they have it here. Yeah. Sorry, this lady actually was just ahead. Yeah, I'll get you first, Paddy.
I just wanted to add to that, and I'm curious, Arthur. Excuse me, thank you very much for your talk. What do you think, having observed this, is the real attraction of the drive, the interest in the GAA? Football or hurling?
I think the way...
Is it the fun? Is it the connection? Is it the skill of the game? Or?
I think it's a bit of everything. I think obviously, I mean, I love the sport. I love Gaelic football. That's a big attraction for me, just the sport. I think a lot of people do have that. But I think that in itself isn't enough. There's lots of great sports out there to play, and soccer is a wonderful sport, and tennis is a wonderful sport, and yet you don't have the same necessarily sort of community sense. I think Paddy touched on it when he talked about home. I think our clubs do provide a real sense of home for people, and there was actually a poem that I was going to read out to you, which I didn't in the end, but it's a poem by Derek Mahan called the Chinese Restaurant in Port Rush, and I thought the end of it just captured perfectly what I guess I'm getting at. So he's describing sitting in a Chinese restaurant in Port Rush, where he's close to where he's from, and he says, "While I sit with my paper and prawn chow mein under a framed photograph of Hong Kong, The proprietor of the Chinese restaurant stands at the door as if the world were young, watching the first yacht hoist to sail, an ideogram on sea cloud and the light of heaven upon the mountains of Donegal, and whistles a little tune, dreaming of home. And I feel like that poem captured a sort of sense that home is not always as far away as it maybe seems. And what I have felt on the GAA fields in Europe, for example, just a few weeks ago we were in Vienna at a tournament and we were all standing on the sideline furious because the referee had gotten the score wrong in our semi-final and we had lost a game which we had actually won. But I just remember standing on the sideline and thinking, we're not in the suburbs of Vienna, we're actually at home, because this is the most familiar feeling to us. And I think that's what it is.
I can understand that perfectly with Irish people. Of course, there's that. But it's the attraction for...
But exactly, but I think that home feeling is infectious. I think that feeling of home and community is infectious. And it's not about an Irish home, it's home. It's a place where you're welcome, where you're made to feel welcome, and where, to be honest, it doesn't matter if you can play Gaelic football or not. The level is irrelevant. It's not that you're looking for, when a great footballer from Kerry walks in the door, you're happy to have him. But it's really not, we're just as happy to find someone, which happens to us all the time, who's from anywhere, who just wants to be part of this community, which ultimately supports each other. And you don't find that easily anymore in these big cities. We live in individualised lives on our phones. You know, it's not the same as it used to be, and I think the GAA really does provide that for people. Absolutely. I think the number one is the ethos of the GAA, which is something we see here. We see it with the home clubs here. Anyone who loves the GAA here, who's part of a club here, has that same feeling, but it's something you're more likely to take for granted because you've had it your whole life. But when you have it then replicated abroad, it's even more potent and more powerful, because that elusive ancestor you're talking about here at the conference, but also that elusive home, which has been taken away from you, suddenly becomes something you can grasp again.
For me, GAA was you're training the under 12s, you're having a better run than we should. You're down to 9 years old to get the team out because you're in the back end of the West Cabin. The game's going in all directions, they're running like terriers. 1 minute they're 3 points in front, the next minute they're 3 minutes ahead. You got their head above our 6 points in front, and we Paddy standing next to you. And you say, go on, Paddy. And you know he has potential to lose that game, but he has to get it run out.
Yeah.
And that's what it was.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now Paddy's down there in SWAT, now in the heads of all the other people, still interested in the game. That's 50 years ago.
Yeah, no, that is it. I think you've put it very well. That's exactly it. It's about including people and bringing people together to work for something that's bigger than yourself, or bigger than being good at something. Yeah, absolutely.
Does it include young children and all that?
Yes, I should have mentioned that as well. That's a new.
She went to Luxembourg and she said the GAA saved her. She had 2 small children.
Yeah. That's a very important part. Yeah. That's a very important point to mention. It's not everywhere. Of the 500 clubs that are abroad, the vast majority would not have youth setups, but increasingly in, for example, the United States, it's very, very important. In New York, it's really vibrant. In Canada, and increasingly in Europe. For example, even in Berlin, there's a second club in Berlin. We haven't always had the best of relations, but where I have to give them real credit is they've developed a youth system, which is really taken off. And it's. I mean, who would have thought that in Berlin, a city like Berlin, which has no real Irish, certainly no significant Irish community, or not one you'd think of historically, that now there's a place to send your children to play Gaelic games. In Munich, there's a very strong one. In those 2 regions I mentioned, Galicia and in Brittany, the youth setups there are extreme. I mean, they've put Gaelic football on the curriculum in Brittany. You can study Gaelic football as a subject for your leaving cert in Brittany, and soon the plan is to make it a national subject but the problem is now, actually, this is an important point as well, the problem now is that it's become too successful and they no longer have the resources to actually bring it to its natural conclusion. And I think it's something the GAA needs to look at. I don't think the GAA fully recognises the product that I don't like to use that word, but that's what it is now, that it has, and how popular it could become. And they actually need to start really thinking about a long-term global strategy of how to put the resources in to maximise its potential. Yeah, because you're already seeing in Brittany they're now struggling because they don't have full-time people on the ground to really push it to the level that it's naturally heading towards.
Okay, Paddy?
Yeah.
No, just wanted to say a big thanks for the talk. You have great skill in explanation, and as a rugby man, I don't have to call it Belfast, I'll share one wee story with you which you can put in your back pocket for talks like this in the future. But the master's courses have set dissertations with two of those who completed dissertations beside me, But there was a gentleman called Desi Doyle from Ballyshannon, and he focused on the impact of the hydroelectric scheme in Ballyshannon in the late 40s, early 50s. And when the scheme was launched, there was a huge return diaspora from all over the world of engineers and construction workers. And it turned out very many of them came from hurling country, North Munster in particular. And he went down and interviewed a guy who was still alive, he was in his 80s, and he had come from Tipperary into Ballyshannon at that time. And he was recounting the fact that Ballyshannon in those 4 years, I think between 48 and 52, had won the county hurling championship, and they'd never done anything in hurling before. And he finished it by saying, having said that, mind you, it was some of the most brutal hurling I ever saw in my life.
Are there any girls teams, we say, for hurling or camogie, we say, or football?
Yeah, that's another point I should have made. I think another part of the strength of the overseas GA, particularly in Europe where we are, is like we don't distinguish between the girls and the men in terms of their importance within the club. And I know it's not always the case here in Ireland. For starters, there's different organisations running the ladies football and camogie here still. But in overseas GA, there is no ladies football board as such or camogie. So they're all part of the one umbrella. It's all GA. So in Berlin GA, we have a camogie team, we have a ladies football team, and they're at all these tournaments that we go to, whether it's in Warsaw or Munich or wherever, there's a ladies football competition or camogie competition run concurrently. So there is absolute equality there, and it's part of the reason for its success.
And do the girls, we say up to 12, do they play with the boys like they do here?
Yeah, they would. Maybe, I don't know if it's up to 12, but it needs must as well, because they've limited numbers obviously, so they take whatever child they have and put them all in together. But increasingly they have the numbers now to develop it in the way it probably has to be developed growing up, yeah. But there's a very vibrant ladies football and camogie scene overseas, probably even more vibrant than it already is in Ireland, and it's doing very well obviously in Ireland. Yep.
Did you see
Pardon me.
BBC Northern Ireland very good programme, I think it was on Sunday night, about the GAA club that's been set up in East Belfast?
Yes, I'm aware of it, yeah.
All communities together.
Yeah.
Speaking Irish in every conceivable version you could imagine.
Yeah.
That's some incomprehensibly, but it's doing fantastic things right in East Belfast.
Yeah, I think I mean, I know Joe Brawley tells a famous story. I don't like to quote Joe Brawley too much, but
starting 4-year-olds, I think, going up to 16.
Yeah, it's that inclusive thing. Yeah, like, I mean, Joe Brawley tells this story. He's the famous former Derry footballer and pundit that some very prominent former member of the LVF, sort of a loyalist paramilitary group, who's now a reformed character, said to him at an aside, the problem is the unionists need their own GAA. And I think it's a fair point, because it is that sort of positive and inclusive community, which still some people don't associate it with that. But I can assure you that certainly it is as inclusive as it comes. We would take all creeds.
Would the clubs abroad, you think, the way somebody dies here or somebody is sick and the club swings into action?
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Would it be anything like that?
Well, I think in New York and America, absolutely. I think it's a massive thing in New York, because particularly as well, because so many of the Irish community in New York were not legally living there, or in America as a whole, and so it was more difficult for them, and still is difficult sometimes for them, to access certain services when a crisis happens. If someone's badly injured or if they need certain medical help, and in those situations, GAA clubs rally together dramatically. I mean, you wouldn't be able to cope without them in many of those cases. But it's the same now everywhere. It's a hub. It is a home hub. It's the first port of call now for a lot of people.
GAA is now the most powerful and strongest body in this country. It's the only body that has never been out, has never had a finger pointed at it.
Wait.
And it doesn't mean it does everything right. It's just, I think, very politically astute.
I agree. But also, I think a critical point about that is that nearly 90% of the money the GAA makes goes back into the GAA. That's the key point about the GAA. That's the reason for its success. No one is okay. There's a handful of people maybe are doing better than others out of the GAA, but it's not a money-making organisation. It's a self-fulfilling organisation.
I would just think, listening to you, that the organisations abroad are more working now more on the founding principles of the GAA, whereas the GAA at home is becoming more of a professional body.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
And moving away from how it was set out to be. And I think a lot of times we go to matches, and I've gone to football since I was 4. It's probably tribalism that nearly brings us to the games sometimes, to follow our own. And even hurling great, but football, we're going crossing back and forth, that drives me demented.
I totally agree with you, and I wouldn't like to give the impression that I'm here thinking, the GAA is wonderful and everything it does is great, because I actually give out about it nearly most of the time. But I do agree with you that the ethos of the overseas GAA is sort of back to the
national network. That is what the strength of the GAA is, and every parish. There's nothing.
At the parish level it is voluntary, but at county level it is definitely gone towards more. I'm not saying it's for or against, because the guys have to commit hugely if they're playing for a county team, especially in the A rankings.
But again, that's a sign of its own success, that the standards have gone up to that level just because people are so invested in it. Yeah, but there's a negative side, of course, to that as things get to that level,
Okay.
Bartley had a question.
Oh, sorry, Bartley.
A good team to emerge like present.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Very good. Thanks very much. Okay, so this concludes the afternoon programme. I want to thank all the lecturers. We covered a wide range of subjects, and I think we learned a lot. Thanks to all the lecturers for today's work. There is a link as well to the lecture today on the Cavan Calling website. Now, this evening we're back again for those who want to attend the Cavan Town Hall, where the 8 p.m, where the Dr. Galligan Clothes branch Killinegg and friends will present an evening of traditional music, song and dance with an introduction by Laura Summer-Cool. So some of you may be going, I may have already booked, they may not be booked. I'm sure there's still some seats available at the door, so go along there. For those who are not, we're back here again in the morning. Yeah, there's some food here on the way out. We're back here in the morning at 9:30 for the genealogical workshop with the genealogy staff, and then Dr. William Rolston will speak on researching our farming ancestors, and then we depart for the tour of West Camp.
Just to say that we got a tour without long. The tour isn't as long as we'd liked, but we know there's so many things going on tomorrow night, and probably some of you are booked in for it. So
just be about 2 hours.